My name is Clara Whitmore. I am 33 years old, and until that Tuesday evening in October, I believed changing the locks had finally made my house mine. I was wrong. I had just finished a 13-hour shift at Harbor Grace Hospice outside Portland. My scrubs smelled faintly of antiseptic and rain, and my hands still carried the dry, papery feeling of holding someone else's mother through her last breath. It was 6:42 p.m. when I turned onto our street. The sky was already dark, the kind of Maine dark that settles early in the fall, with wet maple leaves pasted to the pavement like old letters. Then, I saw my parents' silver Buick parked across from my driveway. Gordon and Marianne Whitmore did not wave. They did not get out. They sat behind the windshield until my headlights swept across the cardboard box on my doorstep. Only then did my father start the car. My mother looked straight at me through the passenger window, calm as a woman leaving church after Sunday service, and they drove away. The box was ordinary. Brown cardboard, clear packing tape, a white card tucked under the flap. 4 words, in my mother's narrow handwriting: "Don't embarrass this family again." I should have left it there. I know that now. But warnings from Marianne had never felt like warnings. They felt like instructions, and some frightened part of me was still trained to obey. I carried the box inside and cut the tape with my house key. The first thing I saw was a photograph of my daughter Molly standing outside her elementary school. The second was a copy of our back door key. Under that was a red USB drive labeled, "For the Judge." Then I saw the seashell Molly kept beside her bed. My knees weakened before I reached the court papers. I called 911. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet your phone battery is at 4% right now, right? If that's true, type 7. If not, type 5. Let's see whether I got it right. All right, enough talking. Let's begin the story. 2 officers arrived 7 minutes after I called, though the wait stretched so long that I started counting the sounds inside my own house. The refrigerator humming behind me, rain ticking against the kitchen window. The baseboard heater clicking upstairs, steady and indifferent, as if nothing had changed. Molly was still at her friend's birthday dinner, safe for the moment, and that was the only reason I could keep standing. The older officer introduced himself as Officer Daniel Mercer. He was broad-shouldered, somewhere in his early 50s, with the tired, careful eyes of a man who had walked into too many living rooms where people tried to call danger a misunderstanding. The younger officer stayed near the front door, one hand close to his radio. "Ma'am," Mercer said, "step back from the box." I did. Not because I wanted to. Because his voice was the first solid thing in that room. He pulled on blue gloves and crouched beside the entry table, where I had set the box. He did not touch the red USB first. He did not unfold the court papers. He looked at the photograph of Molly, then at the back door key, then at me. "Do your parents have access to this house?" "No," I said. The answer came too fast. Mercer waited. I swallowed. They shouldn't. That was when I remembered the back door. The winter before, after an ice storm cracked the frame near the mudroom, my father had insisted on fixing it himself. Gordon Whitmore had always liked being useful in ways that made you owe him. He replaced the lock, handed me 2 keys, and told me a single mother should not be careless about security. After I cut contact, I changed the front lock. I changed the garage code. I blocked their numbers. I told myself I had sealed every opening. I had forgotten the door he had repaired. Officer Mercer wrote that down. His pen made a small scratching sound against the pad, and somehow that sound frightened me more than the box had. It turned my mistake into a record. I had texted Ethan only 3 words after calling 911. "Don't bring Molly." He must have driven straight from the marina, because headlights swept across the front window less than 10 minutes later. A truck door shut outside. Then Ethan Rose stepped into the entryway with rain on his jacket and motor oil still dark beneath his fingernails. He stopped when he saw the uniforms. Then he saw the box. All the color left his face. "Please tell me Gordon didn't leave that for you," he said. Both officers turned toward him. So did I. For a few seconds, Ethan seemed unable to decide whether to look at me, the police, or the open box. We had been divorced for almost 2 years, but in that moment I knew his face well enough to understand one thing clearly. He was not surprised by the idea of my father doing something terrible. He was surprised it had already happened. "What do you know?" I asked. Ethan rubbed both hands over his mouth. "4 weeks ago, your father came to the marina." The room seemed to narrow around that sentence. "He said he needed my signature on an emergency plan," Ethan said, "in case you became overwhelmed." His word, Clara, overwhelmed. He said your mother was worried about your shifts, about Molly, about whether you were sleeping enough. I stared at him. "He wanted me to sign a statement saying you had become unstable," Ethan continued. "That I'd seen signs. That I had concerns about Molly being alone with you." My throat tightened. "And you didn't tell me?" His eyes dropped. "I refused," he said. "I told him to stay away from you. I thought telling you would give them more room in your head. I thought I was protecting you." I wanted to be angry. Part of me was. But the cardboard box sat open between us, full of proof that silence had never protected me from my parents. It had only protected the story they were building. Officer Mercer lifted the folded petition with 2 gloved fingers and turned just the bottom of one page toward Ethan. "Mr. Rowe," he said, "is that your signature?" Ethan stepped closer, careful not to touch anything. He looked at the page for less than a second. "That's not mine," he said. No one moved. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, the house I had worked so hard to make peaceful felt suddenly unfamiliar, as if every wall had been listening for weeks and had only now decided to speak. Officer Mercer did not answer Ethan right away. He only held his eyes for one long second, then slid the page into an evidence sleeve, as if the paper itself had become dangerous. The younger officer stepped onto the porch to speak into his radio, and through the half-open door, I caught only pieces of his voice between the rain. "Possible forgery. Custody petition. Supervisor requested." Each phrase landed harder than the last. Mercer turned back to the box and removed the USB without plugging it into anything. Then he lifted the hospital bracelet. Molly's name was still printed in faded purple ink, her birth date beneath it. The plastic curled slightly from age. I had not seen it in years. I thought it was in the baby box at the top of my closet, tucked between her first pair of socks and the card from the nurse, who said my daughter had lungs like a storm siren. The last time I remembered seeing that box, my mother had been standing in my closet 6 months earlier, smiling as she folded tissue paper around Molly's old blankets and said she was only helping me organize memories. I was too tired to sort. "How did they get that?" Ethan asked. I did not answer, because I already knew the question was too small. The right question was how long they had been taking things. Mercer unfolded the remaining papers and read in silence. His mouth tightened once, not dramatically, just enough. The petition never called me a bad mother. That would have sounded cruel. Instead, it called me exhausted, unstable, overwhelmed, and unsafe. Soft words for a hard accusation. According to the pages my parents had prepared, I worked excessive shifts, used sleep medication, missed medical appointments, left Molly unsupervised, and suffered from unresolved family trauma that made my home unpredictable. None of it was true. That was the frightening part. The lies were not wild. They were ordinary things bent slightly out of shape. A long shift became neglect. Melatonin became medication abuse. A tired sentence after work became emotional instability. My life had not been described. It had been edited. Then Mercer found the counselor's letter. It was printed on cream paper with a letterhead from someone named Dr. Meredith Sloan, a licensed child welfare counselor in Augusta. She claimed she had reviewed family observations and believed Molly should be placed temporarily with her grandparents before an avoidable crisis occurred. I had never spoken to Dr. Sloan. I had never heard her name. Ethan leaned forward. "Clara, I swear to God, I didn't." "I know," I said. And I did. My parents had always been better at borrowing other people's voices than using their own. Mercer reached into the bottom of the box and lifted the seashell with two gloved fingers. It was small, white, chipped along one edge. On the underside, in blue marker, was Molly's crooked M. For a moment, the petition, the forged signature, even the photograph outside the school all faded behind that tiny shell. "That was beside her bed," I said. My voice sounded far away. 3 weeks earlier, Molly had asked me if I had seen it. I told her to check under the nightstand. She had cried for 6 minutes, embarrassed by how much she cared about a shell, and I had promised we would look again on Saturday. Mercer asked permission to check her room. I led him upstairs. Molly's blanket was folded crookedly, the way she left it every morning. Her drawing of 2 seagulls hung above the dresser. The moon lamp glowed softly, because she hated coming home to a dark room. But the drawer of her bedside table sat open half an inch. On the white painted window frame, near the latch, were 3 fresh scratches. I stood in the doorway and could not make myself step farther inside. I had spent 7 years teaching my daughter that her room was hers. My parents had turned it into evidence. Officer Mercer did not ask me to touch the window. He photographed it with his phone first, then told me to keep Molly out of the room until someone from evidence could look at it properly. The younger officer came upstairs, glanced once at the scratches, and stopped looking like he was standing inside a family argument. He looked like he was standing inside a crime scene. That was the moment the house changed for me. Not when I saw the box. Not when I saw the petition. Not even when Ethan said the signature was not his. It changed when a police officer stood in my daughter's doorway and lowered his voice, as if the room itself needed protection. Downstairs, Officer Mercer asked if we had somewhere else to stay that night. I wanted to say no. I wanted to say this was my home, that I had paid the mortgage alone through double shifts and holiday weekends, that Molly had learned to ride a bike in the driveway, that every wall had a color we chose after the divorce, when I promised her we were not starting over in a sad place. But pride is not the same as safety. Ethan called his sister June from the kitchen. His voice stayed steady until he said Molly's name. Then it broke a little. June Rowe lived across the bay in a cedar-sided house with a guest room full of old quilts and too many books. She taught 11th grade English and had the calm authority of a woman who had spent 20 years telling teenagers to put their phones away. "Tell her there's a plumbing issue," I said. Ethan looked at me. "She's 7, I said. "Not tonight." He nodded and told June to pick Molly up from the birthday dinner and take her home without stopping by my house. I heard him say please twice. Ethan did not say please often. I packed 1 bag for Molly and 1 for me. Pajamas, her allergy medicine, her toothbrush, the whale sweatshirt she wore whenever she wanted to feel brave. The paperback about sea turtles she had been reading with a flashlight after bedtime. I added clean socks, her hairbrush, and the small stuffed puffin she still pretended not to need. For myself, I packed badly. A sweater, 2 shirts, the wrong charger, no socks. I stood in my bedroom holding a pair of jeans, and could not remember whether I had already put any in the bag. Fear does strange things to ordinary tasks. It makes a drawer look unfamiliar. It makes your own closet feel like a place someone else has searched. Before we left, I went back to the entryway. The white card was still there beside the evidence tape Officer Mercer had stretched around the table. "Don't embarrass this family again." I looked at those words until they stopped sounding like a sentence and started sounding like every rule I had grown up under. Do not call for help. Do not tell outsiders. Do not make your mother cry in public. Do not let anyone see what happens behind our doors. That was what the warning had really meant. It was not asking me to stay calm. It was asking me to stay alone. Ethan carried the bags to his truck. I locked the front door, though the gesture felt almost foolish now. As we stepped into the rain, my neighbor Harold Benson came out onto his porch wearing an old Coast Guard jacket and holding a flashlight so bright it cut through the dark. "Clara," he called. "Are the police here about that van?" Officer Mercer turned before I did. "What van?" he asked. Harold pointed toward the narrow service lane behind my house. "Blue cargo van, parked back there late this morning." Around 11, maybe a little after. I thought it was cable repair until I saw a man come through the side gate. My hand tightened around the strap of Molly's bag. Harold looked uncomfortable, like a decent man afraid he had waited too long to speak. My truck was facing that way, he said. Dashcam might have caught something. Plate number, maybe his face. I don't know. Officer Mercer's posture changed. Mr. Benson, don't erase anything. Harold nodded. Wouldn't know how if I tried. Until that moment, I had believed the box came from my parents. Terrible, yes. Planned, yes. But still contained within the small, poisoned circle of our family. Then Harold said the word van. And I understood my parents had not only crossed a line, they had hired someone else to cross it for them. We spent that night at June's house across the bay, but I did not sleep. Molly did. She curled beneath an old patchwork quilt in the guest room, the stuffed puffin tucked under her chin, and accepted the plumbing story, with the easy trust children give you, when they believe adults still know how to keep the world in order. At 2:13 inches the morning, she woke and asked if Grandma Marianne knew where we were. She did not ask about the house, she asked about the person I had spent months trying to keep outside of it. Ethan sat up in the chair beside the window. I told Molly no. Then I stayed on the edge of the bed until her breathing slowed again. In the hallway, June handed me a mug of tea I did not drink. She did not ask too many questions. I loved her for that. The next morning, Detective Nora Callahan took over the case. She met us at Molly's elementary school at 8:40, wearing a dark coat buttoned to her throat and carrying a notebook that looked too small for everything my parents had done. Officer Mercer stood near the office door, while the school secretary, Rebecca Lane, unlocked the attendance records with trembling hands. Rebecca was 58, silver-haired, and precise in the way women become after decades of being underestimated behind a front desk. She had worked at that school for 29 years. She knew every divorced parent who tried to bend a pickup rule and every grandparent who believed love made them exempt from paperwork. When I said Marianne's name, Rebecca's mouth tightened. She came here 12 days ago, she said. My fingers went cold. Rebecca pulled a visitor log from a folder. 1:18 in the afternoon. Pale blue coat, gift bag in her hand. She said there was a family emergency and she needed to take Molly home early. Ethan looked at me. I did not look back. She's not on the pickup list, Rebecca continued. You removed her in February. I told her that. What did she do? Detective Callahan asked. Rebecca hesitated, then said, she smiled. That was the part I didn't like. She said, Clara gets overwhelmed. She forgets what is best for Molly. No one spoke for a moment. The sentence sounded exactly like my mother. Soft enough to pass as concern, sharp enough to leave a mark. Detective Callahan asked for the security footage from that day and the weeks before it. The principal approved it. We sat in a small conference room with a bulletin board full of lunch menus and reading goals while the IT coordinator pulled video from the front entrance. At first, there was nothing but ordinary school life. Children in bright jackets, parents waving from cars, teachers holding clipboards. Then a blue cargo van appeared across the street. It was not there every day. That made it worse. It appeared on Mondays, some Wednesdays, 2 Friday afternoons, always across the street, always angled toward the gate, always long enough for the driver's window to lower. Detective Callahan wrote down the dates. 11 weeks. That was how long the van had been watching my daughter. On one clip, Molly walked out, carrying a paper pumpkin. She turned to show it to a classmate, smiling with her whole face. Across the street, the van window shifted, and for 1 second sunlight flashed off a camera lens. I pressed my hand to my stomach. They were photographing her at school, Ethan said, his voice low. Rebecca whispered. I should have noticed. Detective Callahan did not look away from the screen. People like this count on normal places looking normal. Harold's dashcam came next. He had driven it over himself in a plastic grocery bag like it was something fragile. The video lasted only 37 seconds. Rain on the windshield. The back lane behind my house. The same blue van parked near my side gate. A man in a dark cap stepping out with a small black case. The plate was blurred through most of the footage, but for half a second, when Harold's wipers swept across the windshield, the numbers came clear enough for Callahan to run them. The image froze on the man's face when he turned. I had never seen him before. By noon, Detective Callahan had a name: Trevor Pike, former insurance investigator. License suspended after a civil complaint involving unlawful tracking. After watching the van appear again and again near Molly's school, Ethan stopped waiting for someone else to suggest the next possibility. He called the marina and told his mechanic to clear a bay. An hour later, my car was on a lift. I stood beside a vending machine that sold stale chips and watched Detective Callahan crouch near the rear wheel. When she stood, she was holding a small black device sealed in a clear bag. "A GPS tracker," she said. For a second, I heard nothing but the buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. Then I thought of every place Molly and I had gone in the last 11 weeks. School, the grocery store, the library, the pediatrician, the little beach where she collected shells. My parents had not just watched my house. They had mapped my daughter's childhood. The GPS tracker changed the way Detective Callahan looked at the case. Until then, she had been careful with her words. She used phrases like suspicious pattern and possible unlawful surveillance. After the mechanic lowered my car and handed her the second photograph of the device, she closed her notebook and said, "Clara, this is no longer just about your parents wanting access to Molly." Ethan asked what that meant. "It means we need to find out what they gain if a court starts believing you're unfit," she said. I should have understood then, but fear narrows your thinking. All I could see was Molly's face on that school video, smiling while someone across the street lowered a camera lens. Callahan told me to call an attorney. Not just a family lawyer. Someone who knew my grandmother's estate. That was how I ended up in Evelyn Marsh's office 3 hours later. Evelyn was 68, half retired, and still terrifying, in the quiet way old lawyers can be. Her office sat behind her white clapboard house, on a side street in Yarmouth, with a brass lamp on the desk and shelves full of binders labeled by year. The room smelled like peppermint tea, paper, and raincoats drying near the door. She did not hug me. She did not waste time. "Tell me exactly what your parents left in the box," she said. I did. The photograph, the key, the petition, the USB, the seashell, the hospital bracelet. Ethan sat beside me, both hands around a paper cup of coffee he had not touched. When I finished, Evelyn opened a locked file drawer and removed a blue folder with my grandmother's name written across the tab. Ruth Ellison. Seeing her name made my chest ache. My grandmother had been the only person in my family who never asked me to make myself smaller for peace. She was the one who sat beside me after Molly was born and whispered, "You don't owe anyone your child just because they call it help." Evelyn laid the trust document on the desk. "Ruth left a trust for you and Molly," she said. "Current value, approximately $1.9 million. The number did not feel real. It was too large to fit inside my life of hospice shifts, secondhand coats, and grocery lists written on receipt backs. "I knew there was a trust," I said. "I didn't know it was that much." "Your grandmother wanted it that way until you were ready," Evelyn said. "You are the primary beneficiary and co-trustee. Molly's education fund is protected separately." Ethan looked at me, stunned, but Evelyn was not finished. "There is a contingency clause," she said. "If a court finds you incapacitated, unfit, or unable to care for Molly safely, a backup trustee can be activated." The room went very still. "Who?" I asked. "In the valid document?" "Me." Then Evelyn reached into another folder and slid a page across the desk. "3 months ago, someone mailed my old office an amendment naming your father as backup trustee." My mouth went dry. "It was rejected," she said. "Ruth's signature was forged, badly." For a moment, all I could hear was rain tapping against Evelyn's window. Then she looked at me over the top of her glasses and said the sentence that made the entire box make sense. "Your parents are not trying to rescue Molly, Clara. They are trying to move money through her." Detective Callahan did not let us take the USB home. She would not even let Evelyn copy it. The red drive stayed in evidence, sealed inside a clear bag with my name written on the label. But, by the next afternoon, after a forensic technician had created a working image of the files, Callahan called us back to the station. She did not sound relieved. That told me enough to make my hands shake before we even got there. The interview room was small and too bright. Ethan sat on my left. Evelyn sat on my right, with a yellow legal pad in front of her, though she did not write a single word at first. Detective Callahan placed several printed screenshots on the table. The drive contains 214 files, she said. Most of them were organized for court. Organized. That word stayed with me. Not gathered. Not found. Organized. There were photographs of my car, outside Harbor Grace Hospice, after long shifts. Short video clips of me, sitting alone in the parking lot, with my eyes closed before driving home. A pharmacy receipt for melatonin circled in red. A cropped image from June's birthday dinner showing me holding one glass of wine. A recording of my voice saying, "I can't do this anymore," after a patient I had cared for 3 months died during my shift. The next sentence had been cut away. What I had actually said was, "I can't do this anymore without taking a day off." One sentence had been trimmed into a diagnosis. Ethan's jaw tightened so hard I heard it click. "They edited your life," he said. Callahan nodded once. "That appears to be the intent." Then, she slid another screenshot forward. It showed a folder buried inside the drive, not included in the neat court packet. Raw footage. "The investigator got careless," Callahan said. "Or lazy." The video had been taken from inside the blue van. Gordon sat in the passenger seat. Marianne was behind the wheel, her pale blue coat folded across her lap. Rain streaked the windshield. They were parked somewhere near Harbor Grace. Marianne's voice came through first. "What if Ethan refuses to sign?" My father answered without hesitation. "Then we use the school photographs and the hospice schedule. Once she loses Molly, Evelyn will have no choice. The trust moves." Evelyn closed her eyes. In the video, my mother was silent for a moment. Then she asked, almost softly, "And Clara?" Gordon gave a small laugh. "Clara does what she always does. She cries, then she obeys." No one in the room moved. I looked down at my hands on the table. They were steady. That surprised me more than the words did. For 33 years, my parents had treated my fear like a door they still owned a key to. They had built this entire plan around the belief that I would fold the moment they sounded disappointed enough. Evelyn placed one hand over the trust folder. "Then," she said, her voice calm and cold, "we make sure the court hears every word." 2 days after Detective Callahan played the raw video, Evelyn called me before sunrise. I was in June's kitchen, standing barefoot on the cold tile while the coffee maker sputtered behind me. Molly was still asleep upstairs. Ethan had dozed off in a chair with his arms folded and his boots still on. For one thin second, before I answered, I let myself believe Evelyn might be calling with a plan. She was. Just not the kind that lets you breathe. "Your parents filed," she said. The words were so flat I had to grip the counter. "They actually filed?" "Yes. Emergency kinship placement, Cumberland County Family Court. They're asking for temporary physical custody of Molly, access to her school and medical records, and permission to enter your home to collect belongings for her care." I looked toward the staircase. My daughter was asleep under a borrowed quilt, unaware that somewhere in a courthouse, my parents had turned her life into paperwork. Evelyn continued, "They're claiming you disappeared with Molly after a domestic crisis, that police were called because you were behaving irrationally, and that Ethan is too inconsistent to provide stability." Ethan opened his eyes. I must have made some sound, because he sat forward immediately. "They're using the 911 call?" I asked. "They're trying to," Evelyn said. "They framed it as proof that you created an unsafe scene in your own home." For a moment, I could not speak. That was their gift. They could take the one thing you did to protect yourself and bend it until it looked like evidence against you. By 9 that morning, We were back in Evelyn's office. The rain had stopped, but the windows were still streaked gray. Detective Callahan joined by phone because the criminal side was still moving, slowly and carefully, the way real investigations do when every shortcut can ruin a case. Evelyn spread the petition across her desk. It was worse in print. My parents had not called me cruel names. They had not needed to. They used softer words. Exhausted, isolated, overwhelmed, emotionally reactive, prone to poor judgment under stress. The kind of words that sound compassionate until you realize they are being arranged like bars. They attached the cropped photographs, the melatonin receipt, the edited audio clip, and a declaration from Trevor Pike, who described himself as a family safety consultant, not a suspended investigator. Not a man sitting in a van outside an elementary school. A family safety consultant. Ethan's false statement was there too. His copied signature sat at the bottom of the page, calm and black, pretending he had betrayed me. He stared at it for a long time. "I want to put my fists through something," he said. "Don't," Evelyn replied without looking up. "They would enjoy that." That was Evelyn's gift. She understood my parents without ever needing to raise her voice. Detective Callahan sent over a declaration confirming that a GPS tracker had been recovered from my vehicle, that suspicious surveillance footage existed, and that the USB contained files under forensic review. She could not say everything yet. She could not promise arrests, but she could say enough to keep the court from treating my parents' story as clean. The hearing was scheduled for Monday afternoon. That gave us less than 72 hours. All weekend, my phone filled with messages from relatives I had not heard from in months. Marianne had clearly begun her second performance. My aunt asked if I was getting help. A cousin said my parents were worried sick. Someone from church wrote that children need grandparents, especially when mothers are under pressure. I answered none of them. On Sunday night, Molly sat beside me at June's dining table, coloring a lighthouse with a red roof. She asked when we could go home. "Soon," I said. I hated that word because adults use it when they cannot promise anything. After she went to bed, Ethan found me in the hallway staring at the closed guest room door. "They're not getting her," he said. His voice was quiet. No performance. No anger for the room to feed on. I wanted to believe him, but I had spent my whole life watching my parents sound reasonable to people who did not know where to look for the knife. "For 33 years, I said, "they controlled me in quiet rooms." Ethan looked at me. I turned toward the window, where June's porch light reflected against the dark glass. "On Monday," I said, "they're going to try it in a courtroom." The Cumberland County Courthouse was smaller than I expected. Maybe that made it worse. I had imagined marble steps, high ceilings, something grand enough to hold the size of what my parents had done. Instead, the family court hallway had beige walls, vending machines humming near the elevators, and a bulletin board with flyers about parenting classes and mediation schedules. Ordinary places can make terrible things feel almost normal. Gordon and Marianne were already there when we arrived. My father wore a charcoal suit and the red tie he used for bank luncheons. My mother wore pale blue, the same soft shade Rebecca Lane had remembered from the school office. A silver cross rested at her throat. She held a folder against her chest with both hands, like a woman carrying medical records for someone she loved. If a stranger had seen us, they might have believed them. That was the part I hated most. Molly was not in the courtroom. June stayed with her at the far end of the hall, near a window overlooking the parking lot. Molly had her sea turtle book open on her lap, but she was not reading. She kept looking toward the courtroom doors. Marianne saw her and took one step forward. A court officer moved between them before I did. My mother's face changed for less than a second. The softness vanished. Something hard and ugly looked through. Then she lowered her eyes, touched her cross, and became a concerned grandmother again. Inside, the courtroom felt too quiet. Evelyn sat beside me, her blue trust folder closed under one hand. Ethan sat behind us. I could feel his anger like heat at my back. My parents' attorney began with stability. That was the first word he used. He said Gordon and Marianne Whitmore were devoted grandparents forced into an impossible position by a daughter who had become increasingly overwhelmed. He mentioned hospice work, long shifts, a recent police response at my home, my divorce, my lack of local family support, as if June and Ethan were furniture rather than people. He did not say my parents wanted control. He said they wanted protection. He did not say they followed Molly. He said they had documented concerns. He did not say they had edited my life. He said they had gathered evidence. Then the photographs came out. Me sitting in my parked car after a shift, eyes closed. Molly near the school gate, cropped until Rebecca Lane disappeared from the frame. My hand around a wine glass at June's birthday dinner. The pharmacy receipt with melatonin circled in red. Each image looked small on paper. Each one had been sharpened into a weapon. The judge looked through them without expression. That almost scared me more than anger would have. Then my parents' attorney said, "This is not about punishment, Your Honor. This is about prevention." Marianne nodded gently, as if the word had been written for her. Evelyn Marsh. Her voice was calm enough to make the room lean toward her. "Your Honor," she said, "before this court considers prevention, it should understand what, exactly, the petitioners are trying to prevent the truth from showing." Evelyn did not start with the video. That was what made her dangerous. She started with the photographs my parents had submitted and placed the originals beside them, one by one. The courtroom screen showed me sitting in my car after a hospice shift. Then Evelyn showed the wider image, time-stamped, with my engine off, my phone in my hand, and a text to Ethan that read, "Taking 5 minutes before I drive." The judge looked at the next exhibit. Molly, at the school gate. Then the original. Rebecca Lane stood 6 feet away, one arm extended toward Molly, while 3 other children waited beside the same curb. My daughter had not been abandoned. She had been standing exactly where children stand during pickup. The wine glass came next. In the cropped photo, I looked alone. In the original, 12 adults sat around June's dining table, all holding the same glass for a birthday toast. Evelyn did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "Selective images can create a story," she said, "but they cannot create the truth." My parents' attorney objected when Evelyn mentioned the USB. He called it unverified, inflammatory, and outside the narrow question of temporary placement. Evelyn turned slightly. "The petitioners submitted that USB themselves, Your Honor. They labeled it for the judge. We are asking the court to consider the entire contents, not only the edited files they selected." The judge asked whether the drive had been reviewed by law enforcement. Detective Callahan stood from the back row. "Yes, Your Honor. A forensic image was made. Chain of custody has been preserved." My mother's hand tightened around the edge of the table. For the first time that day, Gordon looked at the wrong person. He looked at me instead of his lawyer. The judge allowed a limited review. The courtroom screen went dark, then brightened into the inside of the blue van. Rain streaked the windshield. Gordon sat in the passenger seat. Marianne was behind the wheel. The audio crackled once. Then my mother's voice filled the room. "What if Ethan refuses to sign?" My father answered calmly, as if discussing interest rates. "Then we use the school photographs and the hospice schedule. Once she loses Molly, Evelyn will have no choice. The trust moves." No one breathed loudly enough to hear. On the screen, Marianne asked, "And Clara?" Gordon gave that small laugh I had known all my life. "Clara does what she always does. She cries, then she obeys." The video stopped. For a moment, even the judge did not speak. I looked at my hands in my lap. They were steady. All those years, I had thought strength would feel like anger. It did not. It felt like sitting still while the truth stood up without my help. The judge denied the emergency petition. He barred Gordon and Marianne from contacting Molly, approaching her school, or entering my home. He ordered that any future filing involving my daughter require notice to me and Ethan. Then he referred the suspicious documents, forged signature, and surveillance materials to the court's fraud unit. As we stood to leave, Ethan leaned close enough that only I could hear him. "You didn't cry." I looked at the table where my parents sat, smaller now than they had looked when we walked in. I didn't need to, I said. Outside the courtroom, my father recovered first. That was always his talent. He adjusted his tie, straightened his shoulders, and looked down the hallway as if the judge had only inconvenienced him, not exposed him. Marianne walked beside him with one hand pressed to her chest. Her eyes were wet, but no tears fell. I had seen that performance at church funerals, hospital visits, and family dinners where she wanted the room to remember her softness instead of her words. They did not come toward me. The court officer made sure of that. But Gordon looked over his attorney's shoulder and said, "You have no idea what you just started." For most of my life, that sentence would have made my stomach fold in on itself. I would have apologized without knowing what I had done. I would have tried to make him less angry so the room could become safe again. This time, I looked at him and said, "Then let everyone see the evidence." Detective Callahan was waiting near the elevators. She had not been allowed to promise anything before the hearing. Now she did not need to. The judge's referral gave her enough to move faster. By that evening, she had a warrant for records connected to Trevor Pike, the van, and the fake documents. 2 days later, officers searched my parents' house and Gordon's small consulting office downtown. Callahan only told me what she was allowed to tell me. They found invoices totaling $8,700 paid to Trevor Pike through a business account Gordon rarely used. They found spare tracking devices in a locked cabinet. They found drafts of letters meant for Molly's school, my supervisor at Harbor Grace, and Child Protective Services. Each one described me as unstable in a slightly different way, tailored for a different audience. In my parents' dining room, officers found a folder labeled Molly Transition Plan. In Gordon's office, they found another folder labeled Ruth Trust Correction. That one made Evelyn go silent on the phone. The forged amendment naming my father as backup trustee was not a desperate last-minute idea. There were drafts, notes, calculations in Gordon's handwriting, columns of numbers showing legal fees, trustee control, projected distributions, and something he had labeled family reimbursement. Trevor Pike was picked up at a motel outside Bangor 3 days later. Once he understood the video from his own USB had survived, he started talking. He said Gordon hired him to document my schedule. He said Marianne provided Molly's school routine, church event dates, and the mornings when I would be coming off overnight hospice shifts. He claimed he never meant to frighten a child. Detective Callahan's voice turned flat when she told me that. People always say they did not mean to frighten the child after they have already followed her. The arrests came the following week. Gordon was charged with conspiracy, attempted court fraud, forgery, illegal surveillance, and attempted financial exploitation. Marianne faced charges for stalking, attempted custodial interference, harassment, conspiracy, and violating the emergency protective order after she sent 3 messages through relatives, asking whether Molly understood who really loved her. By Friday, the story had reached the church committee. Marianne was asked to step down. Gordon lost 2 consulting clients before lunch. People who had once told me to be patient with my parents suddenly began texting words like shocked and praying and had no idea. I did not answer. Their world was not collapsing because I destroyed it. It was collapsing because, for once, I stopped holding up the walls. 7 months later, the case ended without the kind of dramatic trial people imagine when they watch court shows. There was no shouting, no final speech that fixed everything. Just plea agreements, restitution numbers, protective orders, and a judge reading consequences into the record while my parents sat at separate tables and looked older than I remembered. Gordon pleaded guilty to conspiracy, forgery, illegal surveillance, and attempted financial exploitation. He received prison time, followed by supervised release. Marianne pleaded guilty to stalking, conspiracy, attempted custodial interference, and violating the protective order. She received county custody, strict probation, mandatory counseling, and a long-term order forbidding her from contacting us directly or through anyone else. The trust stayed intact. Evelyn remained the backup trustee, exactly as my grandmother had written. A portion of the restitution paid for new locks, new windows, a security system, counseling for Molly, and the legal bills I used to wake up worrying about at 3 in the morning. I did not think of that money as winning. Winning sounded too clean. I thought of it as repair. Molly knew only what a 7-year-old needed to know. Grandma and Grandpa broke serious rules. Adults handled it. None of it was her fault. One night, while we were washing seashells in the kitchen sink, she asked if they loved her. I dried my hands before I answered. I think they felt something they called love, I said. But love that needs control is not safe. She nodded as if that made more sense than I expected. Children understand boundaries faster than adults who benefit from crossing them. We moved back home in late spring. The moon lamp still glowed in Molly's room. The window frame had been replaced. For weeks, I checked the latch every night. Then one evening, I forgot. When I realized the next morning, I cried harder than I had in court. That was how healing came. Not as victory. As ordinary moments that stopped feeling dangerous. I enrolled in the registered nursing bridge program I had once been talked out of pursuing. On the day my acceptance email arrived, Ethan brought Molly over with takeout and paper plates. June cried before I did. Evelyn sent flowers with a card that said, "Ruth would be insufferably proud." I kept the white card from the box. "Don't embarrass this family again." I framed it beside my new student badge. For 33 years, I thought embarrassing my family meant telling the truth. Now I understand that truth was the only thing that ever protected me. When controlling people tell you not to make a scene, sometimes they are not protecting peace. They are protecting the story that gives them power. So, document the facts, ask for help, build boundaries with consequences, and never confuse family with permission to enter your life without consent. The lesson I carried from that cardboard box was not that family can hurt you. Most people learn that in smaller ways, long before they have words for it. The real lesson was that love without respect can become possession, and possession will often disguise itself as concern. Some people do not control you by shouting. They control you by sounding reasonable. They say they are worried. They say they know what is best. They say family matters should stay private. But sometimes, privacy is not peace. Sometimes, privacy is the locked room, where the truth is kept, so no one else can see the damage. Clara's freedom did not begin in a courtroom. It began the moment she stopped obeying the old command to stay quiet. She called for help. She kept the evidence. She let other people see what her parents had spent years hiding. That is a hard kind of courage, especially when the people hurting you are the same people who taught you what love was supposed to look like. And maybe that is what makes this story stay with us. It reminds us that healing is not always dramatic. Sometimes healing is changing the locks. Sometimes it is sleeping through the night again. Sometimes it is watching your child walk into school without scanning every car in the parking lot. Sometimes it is reading an acceptance email and realizing no one can take that future from your hands anymore. Family should be a place where your life is protected, not invaded. Love should make you feel safer, not smaller. And forgiveness, if it ever comes, does not have to mean access. Boundaries are not cruelty. They are the doors we build after someone teaches us why we need them. What would you have done if you found that box on your doorstep? Would you have opened it, or would you have called the police first? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I truly want to know how you see this story and what part stayed with you the most. If this story moved you, please hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next one. Your support helps these stories reach more people who may need to hear that silence is not the same as peace.